Thank you.
I love this. This is important. This is a historic event here.
It is.
So let's throw out the first question, and I'm going to start with Rick on this one.
Go on, mate.
Rick, 2018.
Yes.
You're reading about certain vendors talking about this new idea of XDR.
Yep.
What compelled you to realize and believe that this was something that would be interesting to people? Here we are, is that right? No. 4 years later, I almost blew the math test. 4 years later, here we are. Tell me why you knew that was going to be an important trend.
Well, basically, EDR was the first of the DRs, and it made sense because the previous stance of preventative security based on signatures, really, antivirus signatures, clearly was failing. So we were seeing that EDR had started the rise of endpoint detection response in the early 2010s. I think CrowdStrike probably was founded in something like 2012 or 14. A lot of those companies come out from around that time. And basically what they're doing is fulfilling a need whereby as the signatures-based world was on decline, they said, okay, assume that you're going to get breached, detect it as quickly as possible, and then move to mitigate and fundamentally remediate after that. So you kind of contain the attack, and then preferably try and wipe it out and remove all evidence that you've been attacked, and learn for it from next time. But you are then already, it's a more defensive stance because it's already saying, you know you're going to get attacked because we can't prevent it before it even gets in. So this reactive approach began on the endpoint, I guess because that was the most urgent place for it to start. That was where most of the attacks were taking place. But it's very soon after that, I started talking to companies that were saying, oh, well, we're now doing NDR, network detection and response. Now, the cynic's eye view of that would be that people who were previously doing network traffic analysis and selling it to people that ran networks so that they could improve the performance of their network said, my God, there's a lot of money to be made in security. Why don't we recast ourselves as a security vendor? I know, we are already sitting on the network. Why don't we say now we can actually start detecting bad stuff on the network? And there's this thing going around called EDR. Why don't we become an NDR? So the ball started rolling. And I had other people coming along and talking to me about doing data detection and response, DDR, which I thought it was great because it basically DDR before that was the German version of the German Democratic Republic, but they were actually doing it on data. And you're thinking, well, what are the main areas that people needed to detect and respond to threats? Endpoint is clearly the first. Network was the second. Cloud's got to come third. Now, nobody has really used CDR simply because CDR in the telecoms world means call data record. So it's yet more confusion. But it's
too many acronyms right there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. Or to be more precise, too many initialisms. Because I don't know if you know that, but an acronym is an abbreviation that can be pronounced as a word. Whereas an initialism is the one where you have to read out the individual letters. An easy mnemonic to remember that is NATO is an acronym, USA is an initialism, and unfortunately after Brexit, UK is just an anachronism. But, sorry. So, can you tell them I'm a Remainer? But never mind. Cloud was clearly going to be the third leg, if you like, of the stool, because cloud, you've got to do that. And there's other names. Instead of CDR, they call it cloud workload protection platforms. Gartner creates most of these, of course, because they're the big beast in my world, in the analyst field. But in any case, you need to cover, at the very least, any XDR needs to be able to ingest data from, at the very least, endpoint, network, and cloud. Now, you can expand it beyond that. You can go to email, which is, let's face it, it's a pretty important part of every attack surface. So the email is another one. just in the last few months, really, people are starting to talk about data from the identity store. So whether it be Active Directory or Okta, we're even vaguely considering calling it IDR, would you believe? So you start to see that more and more of these DRs were popping up. And I just coined, because if you've seen people, you remember when everything was being everyone started to talk about things being delivered as a service. What's the first one? Infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and then software as a service, IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS. And then stuff generally started getting delivered as a service. And to generically refer to that whole spectrum, you just put an X in front where the X meant anything. So XaaS was anything as a service. So I did exactly the same thing for DR and started referring to XDR, referring to a whole spectrum of technologies in the detection response space, for covering different silos, if you like, within the enterprise infrastructure. And then the years went by, and my illustrious competitors in Gartner and Forrester picked up on it. And someone said, well, we can't just use X to mean anything. So they then expanded it and started calling it extended detection and response. And in the meanwhile, some companies had come along and said, we're doing XDR. Not just that XDR is a spectrum that we identify in the market, but we're actually doing XDR, of which, these guys are one. And then we got even more specific because we're analysts, so we need to pigeonhole stuff. So then we started talking about Open XDR. I think Gartner talks about open versus native XDR, which I don't like. Not because they're Gartner, but because I just think it's a very, very intelligent way of looking at it. We tend to call it, and this is not my nomenclature, but we tend to call it Open XDR versus comprehensive. And that was a colleague of mine opted for comprehensive because he didn't want to, how can I put it, tee off all the people that offer comprehensive, because what he could have called it is closed XDR, of course. That's got a more negative connotation.
That's a little negative, but we like that, though.
Yeah, well, But so that's a short answer. That's a short answer.
That was the short answer.
Imagine if that was a long one.
That was pretty long, right? But it was value, and there was a lot. And I think the English lesson. I love English lessons from the English. So first of all, you guys invented the language, so got to give you some credit, right?
We invented it. We still haven't got it right, though.
Well, and us Americans are butchering it every day. So there you go. And what can I say? We love the empire, but we threw tea in the water. So before I bring Suzanne into the conversation, I want to ask you a follow-up. So you've walked the floor at RSAC for the last 2 days, I assume. What are your first impressions, or what is your reaction to the fact that probably over 100 companies are talking about XDR now? Here we are. Again, 4 years ago, you pioneered this thinking. People were copying it and butchering it and changing it against your intellectual property, but hey, that's what they do. Yeah. And now you're seeing 150, you tell me, companies talking about. What do you think? What does that tell you, Mark?
So if you stood on anybody's stand and closed your eyes and threw a brick on the RSA floor, you would have a hard time not hitting as an XDR vendor.
Yeah.
There are that many of them out there now. And of course, every one of them is slightly different, has a different but anyway. I think it's the second era. The first era was the preventative era based on signatures. What was that all about? Basically, it meant that you had a company like Symantec or McAfee, the two big guys, right? That became the monsters, if you will, of the preventative era, whereby you required I'm going to use a very kind of COVID-related analogy here, but you needed a patient zero. One of your customers had to get infected with a virus. Then he submitted to you what appeared to be the trouble. You found what that virus looked like, and you created essentially a snapshot of the dodgy code that infected him, and then you spread that picture, which was called a signature, and you spread it to all of your customers. And it was a fantastic model. I mean, it made them billion-dollar companies, right? And doubtless fed some very unhealthy habits on the part of John McAfee, God rest his soul, that we won't talk about here. But suffice it to say that it made them both multi-billion-dollar companies, and was quite successful for many a year, from the 80s, 90s onwards. Basically, then, in the meantime, what happened was, by the sort of turn of the century, and certainly by 2005, 2007, the sheer size of the threat landscape had mushroomed beyond belief. And fundamentally, threats started overpowering that model based on 3 V's: velocity, volume, and variety. And they just couldn't keep up. And I can remember very clearly turning on my home laptop, because I was working from home at the time as a journalist, and basically I'd turn it on at about 8:30 in the morning, go and make a cup of tea, have me breakfast, come back, and maybe in 45 minutes, the sheer number of signatures from McAfee that needed to be downloaded every morning would have finished. That was how slow it got. That was how poor it was. And if that was me sitting at home, a punter, imagine for companies.
Yeah.
So clearly it was starting to fall down. EDR comes along to respond to that by saying, okay, Gov, it's no good. We can't just give you a picture of what bad stuff looks like so you can keep it out at the gate. Stuff's going to get through the gate. Assume the breach, as they call it, which means you've then got to have some really good detection, which means using machine learning, right? Because by now, AI and ML, which are used indiscriminately, we won't go into that, but those kinds of technologies, the cloud has exploded by now, so you can stick all this stuff up in the cloud and do immense number crunching in the cloud. So what you're doing is you're now inspecting the stuff on the endpoint, in the case of EDR, or on the network, in the case of NDR, or even through your cloud instances if you're doing CDR. But in any case, you're inspecting traffic and you're saying, this is bad gear. This is something that looks a bit dodgy. You might not be able to confirm absolutely. You don't need to. You just need to detect that there's something anomalous going on the wherever that detection response technology is sitting. Let's say start with the endpoint. And then immediately move to respond. In the first instance, mitigate it, maybe quarantine it. Then further down the road, clean it right out. And once it started on the endpoint, then it moves to the network, and then out to the cloud. Well, I mean, that is the era we're in now. We've moved from the preventative era to the reactive era because there's just so darn much. The preventative stuff was overpowered. And that's kind of where we are at the moment. And XDR has kind of, or the detection and response technologies, plural, have held sway for the best part of the last decade, really, mate.
Rick, again, another powerful breadth of information there. Before I come back to you, I want to ask Suzanne a question, but think about the whole issue of how a poor prospect walking that floor is going to cut through all that noise and walk away with, what should I do, right? So you think about that. Suzanne, I want you just to react to the fact that we've got the historian, the inventor of XDR,
I have a question for Rick.
Okay,
so 4 years ago, you wrote this article about XDR.
Yes.
And you probably blew everyone's mind. If you were to go back to Rick 4 years ago and you see how much XDR has evolved, anything that you wrote back then that still pertains to how practitioners are using XDR, or anything are you surprised by anything that you are seeing now that 4 years ago you would never have thought we would have come this far?
I wouldn't say surprised, no. Maybe I'm too jaded to be surprised by things. But what's interesting is, first of all, so many of these acronyms and initialisms are bandwagons that are convenient pegs on which many a vendor can hang their hat. So clearly, XDR was the new black for a few years. It's gone beyond that now.
Yep.
It's become too mainstream that it is no longer even a differentiation. Like, you're doing XDR, well, everybody's doing XDR, so what? So it's kind of moved beyond that. Mm-hmm. And Now, you know, someone like probably O'Reilly or whatever his name is will probably come up with XDR 2.0 at some point. But in any case...
Yeah, what are you writing about now?
Oh, yeah, well, I mean, good point.
What's the next big thing?
Okay, well, I mean, what I will say is this, that the reactive technologies are great and were a highly necessary evolution because preventative was running out of steam. That is and we're in the reactive era. However, the next thing that happened was we all cloudified our application infrastructures like crazy. And I don't just mean SaaS, I'm talking about companies getting seriously into infrastructure and platform as a service, which means that their developers then all get involved. They're coming to take me away. And in the IaaS and PaaS world, your developers are getting involved. Once you've unleashed your developers into the cloud, essentially you've lost control because they're going to push so much code so frequently, so rapidly, with so little concern for security because they're not paid, they're not reimbursed for being secure, they're reimbursed for getting the code out there as fast as possible and getting it right, they hope, but therefore all the stuff that they chuck up there to try and to test just stays there. So there'll be 15 orphaned versions of the code before they get it right, and they just sit there in the cloud, which if somebody can discover them, they can exploit. So in other words, the attack surface expands so much with the cloud, and then you throw into the mix COVID, where we all go and work from home, and essentially you've atomized the attack surface to such a degree that what you're seeing over the last, I mean, this is probably now, I'm being a bit reductionist to say in the last year, but probably more like the last 2 or 3 years. But what's really gaining a head of steam is the next era, which is to complement the reactive technology, and that is the proactive technologies. In other words, there's just too darn much for the reactive technologies. I mean, as good as your XDR may be, if it's facing a tsunami of alerts, sure, you want someone, your XDR provider, to give you some kind of a context and be able to prioritize all the alerts it's getting. But the fact of the matter is that there's just so bloody much. The only other way that you can do it as a kind of good governance is to then try to at least reduce the space in which the XDR has to function. And the way you do that is with good governance, with a variety of proactive technologies. And by those, I mean, you'll see them out there. There's all these things coming out. Unfortunately, there's not one single little acronym or initialism for them all. But you're seeing people talking about security posture management. Mm-hmm. You're seeing people talking about attack surface management. Even the old breach and attack simulation guys are trying to jump on the bandwagon. You're seeing, and of course there are kind of, even before proactive was a kind of an era, as I'm describing it, you've always had vulnerability management and patch management. And what's interesting now is that the vulnerability and patch management guys have suddenly got a new lease of life. Go look at Qualys. Go look at Rapid7 and where they're going, because suddenly proactive has become much more relevant, because the sheer size of the attack surface, thanks to cloud, it's just exploded. Yep. And you're not going to keep up, however good your reactive technologies are. So you must shrink the attack surface and then have your reactive technologies focus on the bit that still must remain exposed. And that's what I'm seeing this year.
Yeah, that's a huge trend there, Rick, and I think we agree. In fact, a lot of the speakers of the last 2 days have talked about the idea of coming in with a service to help you understand your blind spots, do an IR or pen test or even a blue team, red team kind of thing. Yeah. Because no one knows what their gaps are, but they don't want to hear a sales pitch until they understand. Yes. Because someone help me. So let's get Susanna to drop a question or have a comment. What are your perspectives, Susanna, over the last 3-4 years? You've been marketing this for a long time. Anything you want to jump in on what Rick said, or do you have additional thoughts? Or
I have a question. You say that we're trending toward proactive. In your opinion, what's the real difference between proactive and preventative?
Well, preventative, what I refer to as the preventative stance, is what used to rely on that patient zero taking a snapshot, or what, if anybody used to watch old black and white FBI movies, what would be called an identikit picture of the virus that would be spread everywhere and then blocking it at the door. Now, proactive is actually getting ahead of the attack, not waiting to be attacked, and just going out and finding vulnerabilities, misconfigurations, anything, any doors that can be locked. Oh God, sorry, that's a particularly sensitive issue, isn't it, at the moment in the States? I didn't mean that. Apologies. Anything that you can do to lock it down. I mean, it's no coincidence that zero trust has become, again, completely, like, everybody's doing zero trust, apparently. They all claim to be. But, I mean, zero trust, which has been around for a decade as a concept, the reason that suddenly everybody over the last 3, 4, 5 years has really started to pick up on it is because it's another way. It's not a technology. It's a state of mind. And all it is really saying, okay, I'm going to assume that nobody is honest. Yep. And I'm basically going to block them all until they prove otherwise. Nobody and no thing, no system, no nothing. I mean, it's the joke I make about, joke, but the analogy I make with zero trust is if you was to invite somebody around your house for dinner, a friend, and they come in, they knock on the door, you open the door, you see this your friend, you say, hello mate, coming in, yeah. Go and take a seat, and you sit them in the living room, and you make them a cocktail or something, and the pair of you sit there and have a little chat. Then you say, look, I'm just going to pop out to the kitchen because make sure that the roast's doing all right, and you leave them there. Now you've left them in the living room; they've got the run of the house at that point. They can be rifling through your all of your cupboards. If they're really smart, they might go behind the paintings and find that wall safe that you've got. In other words, they've got the run of the house. Now, and that is the old model, trust at the door. The new model, the zero trust model, is, you let them in. Hello, mate, coming in. Sit yourself down. Great. You still have that cocktail with them and have a little chit-chat, but as soon as you pop out to the kitchen to make sure that the roast's all right, they're locked in the front room, so they can't get out. The stuff that there's nothing is open. There's padlocks on all of the cupboards and everything. There's absolutely no way that they can get through and see what you've got available. They can't move into other rooms around the house. No lateral movement, as they call it over there. Mm-hmm. And one other little detail: they're also on CCTV all the time. So you are, because zero trust is really
zero trust.
Trust no one, never trust, always verify, and continually monitor. That is the spirit of the age, the zeitgeist. And in a sense, bless you, what you're then seeing is that some of these technologies that we're talking about are attempts to implement that in a technological fashion.
Yeah. Well, there is some overlap with XDR and zero trust in that early detection and early response and constant monitoring.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Constant monitoring.
Yeah. You want to throw another question in, Suzanne?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that you're right. Zero trust is kind of the new wave. Do you find that as an impediment for business, just continuity and running a business, the permissions, the management?
Yeah, I mean, look, if you're going to adopt a zero trust approach to your security, you're going to have to get it right. No, let me put it another way. You're going to have to prepare the field well. What I mean by that is, look, for people like me, the kind of Joe Public in the company, the lowly employees, you can probably get away with just sending them an email and telling them, listen, it's going to be a bit different. But for your power users, the guys on the board, the director of this or the CXO, of whatever it is, the guys who are used to having access all areas, they're going to chafe a little bit at suddenly being being restricted, number one, in what they can access, and number two, being challenged to authenticate themselves every time they want to go to another resource. So there will be pushback.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you have to prepare that. It's a cultural change, not
It
just
is.
a technology change.
Right.
And that one's hard. And yeah, I can imagine it would be a process that you would need to take a reasonable amount of time on, which could be slow down your progress.
Yeah, well, it's digital transformation, cloud, they challenge those old boundaries.
Absolutely.
So it's what do you think about this movement to the security of the API and looking at that as a conduit? That would be quite challenging if every API had to be tested in real time, constantly, every bit exchange. Where would you draw the line with zero trust? And how does it map back to XDR? We're always trying to bring it back to XDR, Rick.
I think with APIs, you've got to look at it in both in the pipeline and runtime. The pipeline, again, is a more proactive approach where you're trying to, before anything is pushed into production, you're going to inspect the code and say, oh, he's embedded a secret there, he's embedded a vulnerability, there's something misconfigured in this API, it's exploitable. And so you can flag that up before it ever goes into production. That's the best way to do it. And you definitely need API security in the pipeline.
Yep.
And then obviously when it gets out there into the runtime, you've got no option. You've got to inspect every query to it, because it could be someone just simply trying to effectively DDoS it, overwhelm the API.
Absolutely.
Or it could be someone's trying to manipulate it and start using it as a vehicle for exfiltration.
Couldn't agree more. Suzanne, you want a final question here? 'Cause
Yeah,
we're going to want to wrap it up.
To
And
bring it back to Open XDR, we've interviewed a lot of Open XDR users, a lot of MSSPs who have clients and end customers who absolutely love that there's no vendor lock-in, that the vendor agnostic capability and feature of Open XDR is huge. The integration of all the different point solutions. Your thoughts on that? I mean, there are a lot of people, a lot of vendors over at RSA right now who say they're XDR, and we talked a little bit about that. But,
Yeah.
I mean, it's a huge differentiator when you can say you're truly open.
Yeah, I mean, the image I like to use, or the comparison I've been using recently in a few of my my slide presentations when I'm doing some death by PowerPoint, as they call it, is a great way to think about XDR is like an octopus, right? Where you've got a back-end brain and multiple tentacles. And each tentacle is an individual, what you'll hear folks refer to as a sensor. So you'll have your endpoint security system will be one sensor sending telemetry up to the brain. You'll have network sending telemetry. You'll have the cloud sending, and you'll have email. So each of these is an individual tentacle. And the essential difference is that Open XDR delivers the brain and lets you choose the tentacles. Whereas comprehensive, you buy the whole kit and caboodle from one company. And in a sense, it is it's the latest version of that long-standing debate in security between best of breed and one-stop shop. One-stop shop is get it all from me, governor, because it's nice and simple, and it's gonna and if it breaks, you've only got to call me in and I'll fix it. In other words, it's like you get the whole thing from one vendor, and it's straightforward and it's easy. It's pre-integrated and blah 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 blah. Now, if you don't happen to like it, if it misses something, if it's crap in the first place, that's your problem. Whereas the open XDR is potentially more challenging in as much as you've got to make sure that it works with each individual tentacle. But then by the same token, as a lot of people will have several of the tentacles already in place, at least they haven't got to rip them all out and replace with every single tentacle from Palo Alto or anybody else who's doing comprehensive. So they're kind of not mutually exclusive, but they are two different approaches to XDR. What I'm finding is that a lot of the guys who are doing comprehensive are these days kind of going, if not fully open, let's call them ajar. You know,
Just a little bit in.
They're semi-open. They're opening up a bit. And conversely, the guys who are doing open, no surprises here, are starting to say, okay, well, maybe we'll offer you one or two of the tentacles as well.
Right.
So there's kind of a not convergence, but the two are, they're in a rapprochement, as they say in French, between the two approaches. And there are overlaps between them to some extent these days.
Yeah. Rick, I want to just say, because we're going to close this out, but I want to say you've done one of the best presentations here today and yesterday,
Absolutely.
and explaining the history and the nuance of how we ended up with acronym soup to the one that everybody loves, open or closed or native open, who cares, right?
Yeah.
But XDR. So final question, and I'll let you, if you have a final question, jump in, Suzanne, after this one. But Rick, as a visionary, you called this 4 years ago. Now the industry is a believer. Where are we going to go? Are we going to go to fragmentation of XDR, to camps, or are we going to create a new category in a few years when everybody gets tired of saying we're all open XDR or XDR? Now we got to change it again to differentiate. What's going to happen?
I think this kind of rapprochement that I talked about between the two camps tends towards a kind of some different levels. Of course, for each vendor it will be different, but I think we'll start to see more and more hybrid XDR.
Yeah, but how are people going to differentiate? If everybody's a hybrid XDR, we have the same problem we have now. What's different about you? How are vendors? What's your recommendation to customers on the shopping side and vendors on the marketing side? How to cut through that noise on both sides?
Well, look. First of all, you've got to realise that you've got to kind of try to scope out the extent of what you want to do with XDR. I mean, if your fundamental problem is endpoint network, it's one thing. Mm-hmm. If you've got a bucket load of cloud going on already, then you've got another thing to consider. You've also got to make sure you know how wedded you are, how deeply embedded in your company your current endpoint solution is, and your current network technology, or your current cloud security, whatever you're using. You've got to say how truly wedded are we to that? How much are we prepared to give it up? And if you really want to stick with them, then open is the more logical way for you to go. If you're prepared to, or if you happen coincidentally to have a large chunk of the tentacles from one vendor, comprehensive might even work for you. Indeed, mate, I'd go a stage further. If you've got everything from Cisco, they give you XDR for free. Which, now how good that is or not is a different question. Now you've got to put it through its paces, but it's still a freebie, isn't it? I mean, the point I'm making is, I think you have to look at it from the point where you started, what you have already today, and then even the open XDR guys, who if they come in and give you their pitch, you've got to say, okay, now show me that you can actually ingest telemetry from the ones that I happen to have. Not just, don't give me just a list of ones you can apparently integrate with. Tell me for real and show me that I can actually take telemetry from all these. And then conversely, that I can push our actions back down to the individual tentacles to take action against that endpoint or close down that email account or whatever. I mean, they have to be able to show that bidirectional integration with whatever you're using on the tentacles.
Correct.
If they're going to be a true open XDR player for you.
Right. So I'm going to take that as a no, you don't think there's going to be an acronym change imminently. It's going to be a battleground of packaging. Are you right for me? Do you have the right tentacles inside and the right tentacles that I bring? And I think that's what I see in the market. Suzanne, any comments on that yourself?
I think you explained it very well.
I like this tentacle model, by the way.
I like the octopus analogy.
Yeah.
It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And thank you so much.
I agree. Rick, thanks
Everyone
for
give
traveling.
It up for Rick Turner.
Yeah, give it up for Rick.